The subject of this talk is especially important to me because I often have students who don't know what to do with their lives and even question the meaning and worth of their lives. I've been in their position more than once myself, and it's clear that we've been living in a time of spiritual difficulty. If we take the word spiritual in the broadest sense, as when German philosophers speak about Geist, like in the spirit of the times, or the Zeitgeist. Others have talked about it as a crisis of meaning. Spirit and meaning here both seem to have to do with the long-term goals of our behavior and the cultural background against which those goals are formulated. To me, these questions bring us into the realm of morality. If metaphysics and ontology name the domains of what we believe exists, of what is, morality names our beliefs about what we should do. As a kind of historically minded, behavioristic pragmatist, I believe that morality is culturally relative, or maybe I'd say institutionally relative, which means beliefs about what people should do vary from place to place and from time to time. This does not mean that any morality will do in any circumstance. Moral systems emerge from a whole system of conditions that will allow certain types of social organizations to exist rather than others. Edward Rubin, a legal scholar, has called the morality that has emerged from modern, and especially I'd say middle and middle upper class conditions, the morality of self-fulfillment. This morality, the morality of self-fulfillment, differs in important ways from the moral systems of other places and times. I won't get into all its history here. If you're interested in the historical aspect of morality, I recommend the writings of people like Rubin, who I mentioned, Ian Morris, H.W. Matuline, and you can find these listed in the references to this talk. I'll just mention that the modern middle-class morality, the morality of self-fulfillment, is interconnected with our economic system and with political and scientific and other kinds of developments. So what is the morality of self-fulfillment? I'll give you Rubin's definition. According to him, according to the morality of self-fulfillment, people should strive to take advantage of their capacities and opportunities, and should avoid interfering with and possibly encourage the equivalent efforts of others. For those of you who've studied moral philosophy, self-fulfillment is the good that one aims for, and there are certain virtues and oughts or moral laws connected with achieving this good. The morality of self-fulfillment is the morality we follow without really thinking about it. We try to figure out what we're good at and what opportunities exist for making a living at the moment and try to match those two things as best as we can. We try to take advantage of whatever opportunities for pleasure are available to us and try not to interfere too much with other people's choices so long as they don't interfere with us. But the morality of self-fulfillment does not give you very much direction. How do you know what your capacities are? What if the opportunities available to you do not fulfill you? Is there really nothing for the individual to seek beyond material gains? A nice car, a nice watch, a beach house, and social advantages like a diploma, certifications, admiration, respect? Is there no larger social or spiritual project beyond the individual self into which we fit that might give our lives a greater significance? The consequences of the morality of self-fulfillment, for some people at least, have been things like world weariness, alienation, identity confusion. Many people have felt somehow unfulfilled by the morality of self-fulfillment. After wrestling with these questions of meaning and feelings of confusion and despair, some people have tried to introduce alternatives to or modifications of the morality of self-fulfillment. Today I'm going to give you Edgar Singer's version. Edgar A. Singer Jr., as I've talked about in other lectures, was an early philosophical behaviorist who went on to become influential in the development of systems theory. He also wrote a lot about science and ethics. His ethical writings are not specifically behavioristic, but they are compatible with a behavioristic outlook. More broadly, they are empiricist or experimentalist. They're speculative, but it's speculation rooted in the study of history and in careful observation. I'll mainly be talking about Singer's small book, thin book, called In Search of a Way of Life. This was based on a series of lectures he gave in 1947. These were actually the first of the Machette Foundation lectures. There's some interesting history to this, which I won't get into right now, but Singer basically is in a long line of thinkers who had tried to find a morality that was essentially secular, yet appealed in some way to the spiritual side of people. Singer himself takes off from a few phrases in Kant, and you can abstract his doctrine from other 18th and 19th century writers, especially literary writers. I'm thinking of people like the German Goethe and his Scottish follower Thomas Carlyle. I'm thinking of poets like Wordsworth and the French writer Senancourt. The 19th century self-help innovator Samuel Smiles also comes close to it. So do feminist or quasi-feminist thinkers like Florence Nightingale in her Cassandra and Margaret Fuller in her Woman in the 19th Century. Nietzsche's doctrine of the will to power can also be put in this tradition, but I should say historical developments and Nietzsche's own extreme rhetoric have made him pretty difficult to interpret. Singer's moral philosophy, interestingly, might also be called a will to power philosophy. This is a phrase, it's a phrase Singer actually uses and does try to distinguish from Nietzsche's Wille zur Macht, typically translated as will to power. But Singer uses such mellow language and has so much less cultural baggage than Nietzsche that you're less likely to interpret him badly, I think. It's interesting anyway that Singer's lectures occurred just right after World War II, just after Nietzsche's writings had been so badly used by the German National Socialist government. Singer himself, in fact, criticizes the Nietzschean will to power in his book, but this is pretty understandable. By the end of World War II, it was really almost impossible to have a very nuanced view of what Nietzsche was actually about. So the principle of modern morality is, to remind you, is that people should strive to take advantage of their capacities and opportunities and should avoid interfering with and possibly encourage the equivalent efforts of others. So what does Singer think we should do? Singer gives the maxim, "So live the moment that every future moment may find you stronger than you would have been had you lived in any other way." We'll call this the progressive maxim because Singer calls the person who follows it a progressive, and the type of life it leads to the progressive way of life. And I should emphasize that so in the United States, we often use progressive as a political label, but nothing political is intended by Singer's use of the word progressive. And there are some further ideas that follow from the progressive maxim that I mentioned. But first, let me briefly go into the reasoning behind it. So first, it appeared to Singer that humans could not be content with standing still. Every society has its stages of life, youth, maturity, eldership, and so on, with social roles associated with each stage. Likewise, a person's soul or spirit was thought in earlier times to be on a journey from the natural world to the world of the ancestors or to heaven and so on. Both of these things, passage through the stages of life and passage from the natural to the spiritual world, gave life meaning, as we say in English. In the modern secular world, however, the outlines of social and spiritual life have become rather muddled. There are no hard and fast rules about what you should do at any given time of life, and the force of the spiritual world has become less and less potent, and even for many people, disappeared altogether. But we still need an ideal to aim for. by which to organize our lives. We need, as Singer says, a way of life. Singer points out that there are always things we desire. For our purposes at the moment, these could be anything. So things you could desire might be things like home, family, companionship, food, wealth, respect. Now, the way to tell whether the desire you have for something is real is to ask, would I like to have a better chance of getting this thing than I have now? To really want something is to want to improve your chances of getting it. This means that you want more power. We'll get to ethical limits on this presently, but you can see how an interest in power is bound up with any genuine desire. To want something is also to want the power to get it. So we can call the God of Singer's system, if we can put it that way, omnipotence, unlimited power. So this is the ultimate value of Singer's system. So Singer sometimes uses the word God, but God simply names the ultimate value of any system of thought, be it religious or secular. This ideal of omnipotence can, of course, never be obtained. The idea is that one gets incrementally closer to it. So remember, he says, so live the moment that every future moment may find you stronger, we can say incrementally stronger, than you would have been had you lived in any other way. Now, Singer is perfectly aware that his maxim by itself is open to gross misinterpretation. Do we not see examples of this will to power in the Alexanders, the Caesars, Napoleons, and the Rockefellers of history? In the Nazi, fascist, and communist leaders? Singer incidentally calls these Nietzschean heroes, but again, I think this is a questionable interpretation of Nietzsche. But in response to this potential concern about the tyrants of history, Singer asks another question. So he asks, if you would add to your present power of winning such objectives as you may set yourself, to what source of new strength are you to turn in your need? Basically, if you want to get more powerful so that you can achieve whatever goals you want to achieve, where can you get more power from? Singer's answer is that this power can only come from other people. And of course, he's a naturalist, so he rules out getting help from supernatural powers. Now, to anticipate one possible misinterpretation of this, Singer is not thinking here of a zero-sum competition where you gain in power by taking away other people's power. A zero-sum strategy only allows for limited progress. It's limited by the number of people you can take power away from and by the limits of your lifetime. And Singer is interested in the widest possible pool of people you can get help from, which would include both living people and the dead. And he's interested in what happens after your own death. So Singer contrasts power or ability with overpowering. So there's a distinction between power and overpowering for Singer. But to borrow an idea from Jordan Peterson, we could also think of power here not as domination. So we're not talking about domination, but as competence, so ability, the ability to accomplish something, to do something. I'll continue to use the word power sometimes, since it's the word Singer most often uses, but you can mentally replace it with a word like competence if you want. So to repeat the basic idea so far, everyone who truly wants something wants more power to get it, and help in getting what we want can only come from other people. Who are the other people who can help us? Simply put, they are the living, the dead, and the not yet living. The first chapter of Singer's book considers the living, the second chapter considers the dead, and the third and final chapter considers the not yet living, the future generations. Now, among the living, there is the individual person, himself or herself. There are various senses in which you can understand helping yourself. Singer seems to mean autodidacticism, or basically learning on your own without necessarily contributing to the progress of other people. but this would involve, at least to some extent, learning from the dead, from people of the past, or learning at least from a distance from what other living people have done. So perhaps we should just consider what the Victorians called self-help as a necessary component of being helped by others, whether living or dead or not yet living. Let's move on then to help that you might get from your contemporaries. If you're a progressive in Singer's sense, then there are two things you would want in combination from your contemporaries. You would want to increase their willingness to help you, their goodwill toward you, and you would want to increase their ability to help you. The question then is how should you conduct yourself? How should you behave to increase both of these things? So their goodwill and their abilities. It's clear that where two or more progressives are involved, it's in the interest of each to help and not hinder the others as much as possible. This increases both the goodwill and the abilities of everyone involved. So Singer gives a second maxim which he calls the law of a cooperative society. So this maxim goes, "So live each moment that the object of its striving be such as to further with its attainment the striving of each person conforming with the same law." To try to put this into plainer English, every goal you want to achieve should further the attempts of other progressives to achieve their goals. If you want goodwill from other people, and if you want those people to have the greatest ability to help you, your goals ought to contribute as much as possible to their power to achieve their own goals. And of course, their goals will contribute to your own power, your abilities, or your competence. This places some obvious limits on the kinds of goals you would rationally seek, since you need to be aware of whether your goals are helping or hindering other people. For a progressive, not every goal is equally valid or valuable. So if we take into account how other people might help us, we find that it's in the ultimate interest of those who accept the progressive maxim it's in their interest to build a cooperative, progressive community. And likewise, if you go on from this, it's in the interest of a progressive community to build a progressive civilization, a progressive nation, a worldwide progressive civilization. We should not expect this to be achievable in practice, but it is an ideal that we can get closer and closer to. It gives a direction to our behavior over time. Now, the larger the cooperative, progressive community, the greater the individual members have, the greater power the individual members have to achieve their goals. But this, Singer points out, this bigger community comes with greater costs. It involves sacrifice. The ever-increasing knowledge within a progressive community will actually restrain the goals that you can aim for, because we'll learn more and more about what the community needs and about the effects of particular actions on the members of the community. So, for example, you may be very interested in developing a certain new industrial process that will make your business more productive and thus increase your own power. But if this process has bad effects on other people which hinder their ability to progress, this consideration would rule out your new process. So you sacrifice something. Of course, on the other hand, there's usually more than one good solution to any complex problem, so it's likely you could find a new process that not only does not harm your community members, but has some benefit for them. In any case, taking into account all these complicated factors means often doing something more difficult rather than choosing the easy thing to do. Singer, in other words, would have us be heroic. It's easy to be self-interested, but to be a Singerian progressive, you have to be self-interested by way of the community of other progressives. So you have to be self-interested by way of the community of other progressives. This may involve sacrificing and recreating some important part of yourself. M. Scott Peck, who was or tried to be a progressive in Singer's sense, tells a beautiful story about this in his book, The Road Less Traveled. It was a famous book back in like the 70s and 80s. Peck writes about his lifelong obsession with winning at games and how this desire to win eventually got in the way of his relationship with his children. He realized that he needed to change something about himself that he didn't want to change, and this threw him into a depression. But from a later perspective, Peck writes this. He writes, "My depression is over now. I have given up part of my desire to win at games. That part of me is gone now. It died. It had to die. I killed it. I killed it with my desire to win at parenting. When I was a child, my desire to win at games served me well. As a parent, I recognized that it got in my way, so it had to go. The times have changed. To move with them, I had to give it up. I do not miss it. I thought I would, but I don't." Now, if you don't care that much about winning, this example might be silly. Why should someone care so much about winning at games? On the other hand, for some people, it might hit pretty close to home. There are people like this. In any event, there is probably some part of each of us, of each one of us, which we hold dear, some habit or hobby, some idea, some goal that we would have to give up to be a progressive in a progressive relationship with others. You may miss this part of yourself when it's gone, or you may not. But you are the one who will have to decide to kill it. This is one sense in which Singer wants us to be heroic, and one sense in which heroic progressivism is tragic. Let's turn very briefly to the past. We've mentioned that the past can aid us in our progress. How? Well, obviously we can learn from what others have done before us and from the traditions and documents and artifacts that they have left behind. This is the cultural history we can draw on. There's also a biological history, our genetic inheritance. This can also help us too, though it's less directly available to our observation than cultural history. But in either case, we need to be selective about how we use the past. And actually, Singer, in his chapter on the past, primarily focuses on art. Singer sees in art an instrument for inducing the heroic mood. So art induces or can induce the heroic mood. Art, through its orderings of form, its changing styles, and so on, gives us a sense, as Singer puts it, of all that life has lived through. The history of art, and even certain artworks in isolation, gives a sense of progress from stages of lesser power to stages of greater power. And it gives us a sense of the tragedy that is often involved in moving from one stage to another. Partaking of this can stimulate and fortify us on our own difficult path toward greater power. But I would guess and even argue that the study of history in general can give us this perspective too. Beyond the history of art, I think it's relatively easy to understand how the past can help us. There's an old saying, for example, that we can see farther than the people of the past only because we can stand on the shoulders of the giants among them. It might be less obvious to you how the people of the future can help you. So recall the progressive maxim, so live the moment that every future moment may find you stronger than you would have been had you lived in any other way. Now, every future moment should be understood precisely as every future moment, not as every future moment until you die. You continue to be stronger or weaker even after you die. This is because you are always contributing something to the future, which is more or less impactful, more or less useful to the progressives of the future. So Singer gives this addition to the progressive maxim. Of all the ways in which something of a finite being's having lived may outlive his death, that way has the best chance of attaining to a real immortality which contributes to humanity something humanity is bound always to desire, and which without this finite contribution it must always have lacked. That one thing is greater power than any given power. I'll try to put this again into plainer English. The best path to immortality and ever-increasing power is to provide a broadly effective way for other people to enhance their own power. In other words, it is to contribute greater power to others. We remember fondly those who improved the life of their times through some new tool or technique, but we immortalize those who have improved the life of all time through some artistic masterpiece, some momentous scientific discovery, or some new philosophy of life. These things can continue to contribute to our power even after older technologies have been replaced by newer technologies. Now, following on this, I should note that Singer says that there are 3 dimensions of activity in which we should try to make progress, so as to make progress in building a progressive civilization. These 3 dimensions are art, science, and morals. So Singer says that humanity, for all the length of its days, should continue to grow in power. It is necessary that every mortal man should spend every passing day in unsparing effort to advance humanity along each of 3 dimensions of progress: science, morals, art. These 3 dimensions work interdependently on the path toward omnipotence, toward absolute power or total competence. Science increases our knowledge of the world and of our effects on the world. Morals tries to discover what we should do to make progress in light of our knowledge. And art induces the heroic mood so that we'll be able to act according to our morals. And let me finally warn that following the progressive maxim is not a way to happiness. Instead, it's a way to what Singer calls contentment. As Singer puts it, the maxim is an answer to the question, how live the most contented life and die the least reluctant death? Now, Singer's discussion of this is pretty general. He's a philosopher after all. He's making an argument for a general way of living, which is neither the way of traditional religion nor the way of the secular economic materialist concerned only with the pleasures that might be had today or the riches that might be had tomorrow. Singer's philosophy is a kind of self-actualization or self-fulfillment or even self-immortality, whose ultimate end is social progress. In this, Singer is in a tradition that began before him and extended after him. I mentioned some 18th and 19th century names earlier, but there are some more recent writers in this tradition who give practical advice that's worth considering. While I don't necessarily recommend reading Singer unless you're really interested in philosophy, he's hard to read, these other writers are, I think, useful for people from a variety of backgrounds and levels of education who are interested in the progressive way of life. I've already mentioned the psychiatrist and writer M. Scott Peck, whose The Road Less Traveled from 1978 is still worth a read. I'll just mention here his famous and progressivist definition of love as the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. And there's also Scott Adams, the creator of the Dilbert comic and writer of various self-improvement type books. His concepts of goals versus systems and talent stacking emphasize personal progress in Singer's sense of increasing power or competence. But he also has identified a life stage occurring after midlife or so, approximately, during which one should switch from a focus on individual progress to aiding more and more in the progress of others. Perhaps more controversially, I would mention here Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and also controversially, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. You may never have heard these 2 books mentioned in the same sentence before, but they have some important similarities. Peterson's book is broader in scope, but both Peterson and D'Angelo preach a kind of socially responsible personal progressivism that seems compatible with Singer and the tradition Singer comes out of. Both Peterson and D'Angelo are not at all afraid of telling their readers to engage in some arduous lifelong project of self-improvement for the good of themselves and for the good of the world. And with this, I will leave you with thoughts perhaps of how you might add to your own power by adding to the power and goodwill of others. Thank you for listening.